Hi everybody, this is Tim Chavez from Faith Matters. This episode is part 2 of our mini-series we're calling The New Normal. We spoke in part 1 with Ashley Mae Hoiland a few weeks back. For this episode, we spoke with Melissa Inouye. Melissa's been on our podcast before and is one of our very favorite guests and people. After receiving her Ph.D. from Harvard in 2011, Melissa became a senior lecturer in Asian Studies at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She's now working for the Church History Department, and last year published a new book called Crossings. You can find the link to that book in our podcast description. In this conversation, Melissa shared with us her reflections on the crazy year we've had so far. The discussion we had was wide-ranging and includes reflections on lockdown, home church, parenting, and even how we can use a lack of stability as a transformative experience. We're really grateful Melissa came on the podcast and are excited to share her insights. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Melissa, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We are really glad to be able to talk with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So today we are continuing our series on the new normal, where we're going to talk about the changes that we're all experiencing in this pandemic. But we paused the series for a little bit because the conversation has really shifted since May 25th with the murder of George Floyd. And so today we just want to talk about how we can be intentional about constructing our lives post-COVID-19 and now with this acute awareness of the racial inequality in our country. So maybe you can just start with giving us a little bit of context and telling us what the pandemic has been like for you. I think there are so many different experiences. So maybe before we jump into a discussion, it would be helpful to just say, how has this changed your regular life?
Sure. So for me, the pandemic has meant this kind of dramatic breakdown of borders and boundaries. So now when my daughter has a meltdown, I shouldn't have even identified the child. Now an unidentified child has a meltdown, or 48-hour tantrum, or any of these things may have occurred. It affects my work life as well as the other kids' school life. And when we have when we're at home doing family time and cooking a meal together, or doing something a little more elaborate in terms of our family home evening treat, it like the time, it takes up space. It pushes on these other aspects of our lives in ways that are more apparent. And it's been really hard for me to struggle to deal with the breakdown in boundaries, because I kind of relied on those boundaries to help me get work done. And it is hard, when you're at work in an office with a door that shuts and adults all around you. It's really easy to focus and to do the work that's right in front of you. But it's really hard to ignore the piercing shriek followed by angry yells in the room next door, or perhaps like right next to you, because they've come next to you to fight because they want to get your attention. Well, so it's been really difficult for me, actually, because my identity is based on this idea of, I'm Melissa and I get things done. But so often I don't get the things done that I would usually be getting done. And it's also really hard to ignore your kids because they're right there. And it's also really wonderful too, right? It's wonderful to have them around and to spend so much time with them. And we have all these funny inside jokes now because we just kind of been sharing the same space and the same air, going crazy for a while. And so there's all these new kind of experiences that have entered our family lexicon, and the funny things that we talk about. But at the same time, it's really difficult for me because it's like super unproductive from a professional point of view and a writing point of view and researching point of view. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense. The interruption, it takes so much like brain effort to just get back into wherever you left off. We're
Right.
finding that
Yes,
you need a longer day just because of all the times you restart.
right. I don't understand. I'm like, we're supposed to be working from home. I'm not commuting. I'm not going out for social lunches with colleagues or anything, but the day just takes everything and seems taken.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Yeah, we've totally seen that. I'm curious how you feel like from your kids' perspectives, are they experiencing the same issue with not having, not being in a school or not being in a classroom with a teacher who closes the door? Do you feel like they're recognizing that same change with a blurring line of a blurring border?
Well, I think for them, it's actually kind of collapsed the other way. Their world has become smaller again, So the other day, we had a very kind of chilled out, very limited, socially distanced outdoor young men's activity. And it was just one of my sons and this other kid, a single other kid on a hike. But he was just so happy, to be talking to another kid his age. And you could just, he's an extrovert. So you could just see all this like interesting, stuff bubbling out of him. He was so happy to share it with someone who was the same age. So I think they really miss the social aspect. And then the other thing that I think is sad for them is that they don't have teachers, because teachers are not the same as parents. And kids do things for teachers that they don't do for parents. And a lot of the kids' schoolwork they've gotten a bit behind on their schoolwork, or they haven't finished at the same level that they usually finish at, just because they've been dealing with Canvas, and they didn't notice that this quiz was a timed quiz or whatever. It's been tricky for them to deal with online learning. So there were a couple of moments where we were like, what? You haven't turned in your blah, 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 blah. And, that was never a problem because the teachers were nagging them. But like now, again, with this breakdown of boundaries, I'm also supposed to be the kids' teacher and to monitor their assignments. And I actually haven't done a really good job of that. So we've just been trying to keep our other stuff going. And the kids are like, yes, I am doing my online learning. And then you look over the computer and it's like they're on Board Panda or something like that.
Right.
And how about your experience of home church?
Home church has been awesome. We have loved it. And we have done it sometimes in the mountains where it's just beautiful and wonderful. Sometimes we have a kind of really small group where it's just this other woman in the ward who is Chinese, who speaks Chinese. And so then we do the whole church in Chinese. And because we do the whole church in Chinese, it's really short, because my kids don't understand enough to listen to talks or anything like that. So that's really good. What I've really liked about home church is that we can kind of tailor it to the kids and to what our family needs. And it also feels really reverent in a different way. I've noticed just from whenever I travel and from kind of my whole life, whenever I've moved into a new place, those experiences of familiar things in different places are always so moving to me. And I think a lot of actually missionaries have this experience, or when people travel, they have this experience, this recognition that the Spirit doesn't have to come to us in a rut. It can come to us wherever we are, and Jesus can be there whenever we remember his sacrifice and the emblems of his death. So that's quite wonderful.
I love that. I think that's so true. Like if you've ever heard like the sacrament prayer in another language, I think that's one of those ways to just sort of strip out everything familiar and you only recognize what's left, which is just this beautiful, peaceful spirit that you totally recognize, even though so many other things in that context are different. And I feel like that has kind of been home church in a way, like we're being in just outside of a church, not being in a church building has made me listen to the prayer differently and think about the bread that looks, broken differently, and the cups look different, everything. But it makes you really think about the value, what is actually needful about this ritual, and it makes you appreciate it because there's nothing routine about it. There's nothing, it's so different.
Right. Well, it's made me think a lot about how what we usually do is so different from what Jesus did, right? So as you say, you have like the different breads. So one day we were chewing on this like very hard sourdough or something. It wasn't sourdough. We were like, had these big chunks of bread and we're just kind of laughing quietly as we chewed on these big chunks. And, but it just made me think, there's all these different kinds of bread. And I was thinking, well, what was Jesus's bread? Jesus's bread was flat bread or some sort of pita bread, right? And it's just really fun to think about how what we do actually is nothing at all like the bread that Jesus used or the language that Jesus spoke or the place where Jesus was, and yet we find that valid. And it helps me think about how other things that we have aren't necessarily, how other things that we have also changed. For example, we're speaking English, and at the time of, in the early Christian church, the British Isles were where the barbarians lived, and they had all these crazy pagan ideas that later on infected Christianity in these different ways, like, Easter and Christmas and those kinds of holidays. So it's helped me to kind of think about culture and think about how our culture shapes our experience of Christianity.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people have had this really, beautiful experience at home, and, they've kind of, I've heard it said, and I admit to thinking it somewhat like, man, this is like, I could do this forever, but at the same time, I think if you examine it a little bit more, there's certainly something that we're missing. Like both, for our kids, like you said, there's something like kids will do stuff for teachers that they won't do for parents, but also for us as adults. And so has any of that come into relief for you? Like seeing what we're missing as we don't get to gather each week at church?
I miss hearing other people's experiences. What often happens in our Sunday school and Elite Society classes is that we have some really good teachers, and they're really good at relating scriptures to everyday life. And at a certain point in these lessons, people always share their own experiences, and they're always quite touching. Or they're always really important, and they feel like they identify problems that I hadn't thought about before, and I become more aware of the things that people struggle with. So what I do miss is just being with my Latter-day Saint community and just being together and talking together and studying together. And as you say, I especially miss my kids not being in primary and learning how to sing, and learning the lessons that are in the songs. So actually this quarantine, I've said, we need to play more of the primary song, because they're not getting that primary. So I was playing the children's songbook CD on the computer, and it was blasting through our house, and the kids for the first time heard that song that says, "Cleaning my room is fun to do, fun to do, to do." And they said, "That's propaganda! They're trying to brainwash us." But I do believe that the hymns have a very, useful propagandistic function in terms of, teaching children and getting these ideas in their head. I'm trying to be like Jesus, love one another as Jesus loved you, try to show kindness in all that you do. So I miss that as well, because, it's always nice to have other people teaching your kids, and setting examples for them.
Do you, if we could fast forward and we're back to normal life, is there a way that you would like to do Sundays differently?
Like to do Sundays differently
after this experience being at home? And
maybe every fourth Sunday we could go meet in the tops of the mountain or something like that. That'd be awesome.
That'd be awesome. Yeah. I think I feel like the only dread I feel about gathering again, because I miss all of those things that you've mentioned. I miss, being with neighbors and singing the same songs and hearing other people's perspectives, whether, things I haven't thought about or things I that are troubling to me that, send me off in a new direction of study. I miss all of those interactions, and I miss, just the community, like knowing when somebody's sick or when somebody's had surgery, and just like the regular FaceTime. I really miss that, just knowing what's going on in other people's lives and them knowing what's going on in mine. I think that's been hard, but the thing that I dread is the busyness. I've loved so much just waking up on a Sunday, and it feels like a Sabbath day. It feels slow and calm and peaceful. And I don't know how to do that when I gather. And I can't even put my finger on what was so busy when we go to church. Maybe it was just getting dressed and finding the shoes, and I don't know, but that's the part I dread. I don't ever want to feel like Sunday is the most stressful day of the week. And somehow I would make it that way. So I don't know. That's what we got to figure out. Maybe it's that we don't look quite so cute.
I was just thinking, it's probably because you have really sensibly respectable standards for how your children should look when they go to church. I have this one
Really?
kid,
Yeah.
I kid you not, has worn his snow boots to church for the past month.
Yeah.
We haven't been able to find his shoes. They just disappear like on Sunday morning. And if I really were more diligent, I would, research the location of these shoes, and I would quarantine them on Saturday night and put them somewhere special. It just hasn't happened. So we have a kid who legit has gone to church in snow boots for months.
Well, there you go.
That is not my particular problem with church, but I have other difficulties, I guess, in feeling stressed out. Like, I don't know, getting everyone out the door, not planning enough to get us to there, like the transportation issue or the locomotion issue. Those are problems for me.
Yeah. And maybe that is the story of the pandemic. It's just, it really is it reveals your values. So, maybe the Sunday shoes, that's not a value. And that's good to know, because it was really stressing me out. And now I know that that's not how you keep the Sabbath day holy. So we can adjust and not be quite so stressed when we go back to gathering. So I would love to get into, talk more about this idea of kids and developing talents and filling up schedules, not on a Sunday, but a regular day. I think something that I've heard a lot of people talk about is just sort of regretting the time that they put into kids' sports and activities and things that, with one child can take up your entire life, but you have 2 or 3 or 4 that are all in some activity, and your week can become just about driving and waiting and watching. And so would you just talk about how you think about developing your kids' talents, and is that a value and a priority, and how much of your week does it take up, and is that going to change after we can get back to normal?
That's a really good question, and it's a very fraught question, right? Because we all want our kids to develop their talents, and we want them to be able to do things so that they can, be people who are useful and able to help other people. So I would say on this question, I kind of seesaw back and forth, but I've generally, the pandemic has helped us to kind of move away from super organized activities. So obviously when everything was shut down, there was nothing to do. And that was great for our kids because they got really bored and they started watching this guy, what's his name? I think the King of Random, or some sort of, all these crazy videos on YouTube, and they decided to make a foundry. So then they got a bucket of metal and they mixed.
This is your kids, not the guy. This is your kids?
Yeah.
Your kids are making a foundry.
Yeah. They got a bucket and they mixed it and they filled it with, concrete, or was it plaster of Paris? I can't remember. They both look like pancake mix to me. So they mixed this thing, and they started melting down aluminum cans, and now they make all these really cool like aluminum ingots out of aluminum cans, which is really cool, right? Because it's nice to know that metal melts at a certain temperature, and it's nice to know that things are dangerous and they have to be super careful or else they're going to hurt themselves. So that's really good, I think, for them to kind of deal with risk. And my husband and I do kind of like supervise them so they're not completely, going to burn their hands off, I hope. But yeah, that was really good. And my daughter is really into plants. And so she's just been wandering around in the wetland park across the street and learning about plants. She discovered that there's this berry that's edible. It's called Pocopecia, and it's like a golden currant, and she like brings them home every day now. So she doesn't like to eat them herself, so she just gives them to me to eat. But they're quite tasty. And she's also got this book on edible plants, and now she's just devouring that book and talking about all the different plants that are edible. Though I'm still on the lookout for the Rocky Mountain Death Chemist. Have you ever seen the Rocky Mountain Death Chemist?
No.
No.
It's like, apparently it looks just like a wild onion, but it's like death. If you, touch fall into your eyes, it's death. So that's kind of exciting. Again, it's about the real world around us and risk, and oh dear, it's kind of frightening though. But yeah, so the kids have been learning things, is I guess my conclusion. And at the same time, I've also made them learn other things because I wasn't really convinced that they were learning a lot with online school. So I just made them memorize poetry. So
Love it.
yeah, I don't
So-
know.
I love that point. Like, boredom isn't bad. Like, boredom is where you get interesting ideas. You're not going to learn that playing soccer or basketball or doing all of these things that are very prescriptive.
Right.
If you're home with nothing to do, you think of interesting things like that.
And in some ways, I think it frees us from youth culture. In different places, youth are expected to do certain things. In Hong Kong, kids are expected to study late at night, and everyone in Hong Kong, all the kids in Hong Kong have glasses because they're all nearsighted. And
Wow.
in Utah, kids do, you have the option of soccer, football, basketball, baseball, and swimming. Maybe there's like 5 or 6, kind of standard options. Dance, right? Gymnastics. Anyway, but if you think about it, like, those options kind of happen based on like how many people generally want to do those kinds of things. They don't necessarily fit what your kid could do or wants to do or would learn from. So in some ways, the pandemic, by kind of disrupting all culture, has freed us to create our own individual and family cultures, which is fun because sometimes culture can constrain what we see as possible. And in some ways, the pandemic has opened that up.
So I wonder about, though, if there's like, and maybe not everybody thinks about this, as much as I do, at least subconsciously, but like, I feel like there's this tyranny of college admissions a little bit where it's like, yeah, our kids, memorize poetry and like, we're super creative and found out all about these particular type of birds or whatever it is, but it's like, you can't put that on a college application and have it be recognized the same way that, playing on the basketball or soccer team in high school or would. And so I worry about that because I feel like a lot of what, again, subconsciously I want my kids to do is driven by like how I think that that's going to be perceived by the establishment a little bit, as they mature. And so I've really been able to like enjoy this time because I feel like, okay, nobody's kids are, making progress, and so mine by comparison don't have to in order to get into college or whatever. But I worry that, as soon as, things, call it a year from now or whatever, things are kind of back in the normal swing. It's like, okay, I'm going to feel that pressure. Like they've got to be doing this, they've got to be doing that because, those are the line items that those admissions people want to see. Or maybe I'm making too much of a deal of this in particular, but I do on some level think about this on a regular basis,
Mm-hmm. In our family, we have a pretty wide range of collegiate experiences. So as you know, I spent time at Harvard for my undergraduate and my graduate degree. My husband started out in a community college and transferred to BYU. And then from there went to UCLA, and from there got a job at a pretty good law firm in LA. So because we have this big range, and because basically Joseph is, both of us haven't had, extraordinary opportunities or extraordinary disadvantages because of, actually, that sounds like a really privileged thing to say. So obviously it's been really good that we've gone to college, but I guess what I'm saying is that it's not super important for our kids to go into a really fancy school, because I think if the kid is motivated to learn something, they can start anywhere, community college, or they can be electricians or something like that. As a person who interviews for admissions for Harvard and Utah, I am often struck by the amazing preparation of the students. They're super prepared. They've done every single thing, and they have top test scores and everything. And I'm not the college admissions person, but I guess what I'm saying is it's really unique and awesome to find kids who are really original thinkers and who have kind of original interests, because, if everyone looks like the same kind of person, sometimes like they all have perfect test scores and they do like, they're on the sports team and they play an instrument. But I think what really sets people apart is their originality and their sense of intellectual independence, which comes, I think, when people have the freedom to pursue what they really love intellectually and to pursue knowledge because they want to pursue it. So, yeah, I have the same problem of worrying about getting my kids into college. And I think sometimes I feel like I've given them a lot of pressure. I feel tortured this way, right? So I worry that the kids are overscheduled, and then I worry that they're lazy at the same time. So I don't know. I think this is just what it means to be a parent. You know, you want them to not be lazy, but you don't want them to feel pressure. So
I feel that same way. Like torture yourself. That's a good way to put it. Like they're overscheduled, they're lazy, and I think that on the same day. So one of those things can't be true. But I really love that idea, like letting them kind of find these interesting hobbies, like things that really speak to them. Like, of course, that would create a more well-rounded person who's able to contribute because they know themselves and have discovered how to melt things and have memorized poetry that they love, or, you know, I think that makes sense. Like if our goal is not just college admission, if we could set that aside and our goal is that they are confident children or adults who can really make a difference in the world, then I think maybe those activities would look like a little more freedom to do something interesting and not quite so cookie cutter. Like maybe it doesn't have to be being the best at a competitive sport that all of their friends are doing.
Yeah, and that's
that's not what they love.
Our kind of parenting style has been heavily influenced by the places we've been. So when you go, you know, in certain places, some things are considered essential and then other things are not even on the radar screen. So it's really kind of freeing where you see how in one place, everyone's got to do something or else, but then in another place, no one does that thing and everyone's fine. So yeah, I just feel like the kids are probably not having a education that is hardworking and requires as much discipline as an East Asian education, where they really, really work long, long hours and get very little sleep. And they're probably not having the kind of happy, chilled out New Zealand education that we originally had them in, because we're now in the United States. So I feel like, you know, it's very freeing when you see all the different lives that you could have, and you realize that not any one of those lives is mandatory. And so then it's a little better that way.
Yeah. Or at least just that it's not the only way. I think I get stuck thinking like there's one right way.
Right.
And I'm either succeeding or failing.
Right. Yeah. There's lots of things that kids can do to be useful and happy. And
yeah.
I read a really interesting article in The Atlantic a few months ago. It's called "Stop Trying to Raise Successful Kids and Start Trying to Raise Kind Ones."
Oh,
and it was just really kind ones. Yes, and start trying to raise kind ones. And it was just really interesting because the people that wrote it are actually very, very successful. Adam Grant, I remember, was one of the authors. Professor at Wharton. It's a New York Times bestselling author and all these things. But they talk about how trying to set kids up for success often, in a world that's sort of inherently competitive, can actually, like, if we push them to succeed too hard in a zero-sum game, you're actually encouraging other people to take losses, And they say that there's actually some indication that focusing more on raising kids to be kind can foster relationships in a way that in the long term, in an academic setting or in a career, having those warm and supportive relationships can actually help you to be more successful too in the things that you want to accomplish in the long run. And so,
go ahead.
No, that's it. And so I just really enjoyed that it sort of took away that zero sum analysis a little bit and said there's a way to do both of these things.
Right. Well, what I was going to say is that my cousin had recently pointed out to me the study that I'd forgotten about, but they did this longitudinal study. I think it was at Harvard, and they just tried to figure out what was it that made people successful. And they did this over, I think, decades, from when they were in young adults to when they were in their 70s or 80s. And the key ingredient was warmth. in their relationships. And
Wow.
people who
That's
had
fascinating.
that warmth in their relationships, like in their family relationships when they're growing up, and also, who maintain that with other people, were the most successful.
I love that.
Yeah.
Especially because like during the pandemic, like I feel like one good thing has been in our family, there has been an increase in warmth. And it seems like warmth is correlated a little bit with unstructured time. When you're just shuttling or, doing some activity in a really, really structured way, there's not a whole lot of warmth there. You're learning things and accomplishing things, but like when you're just sitting together and don't have a plan, it seems like that if you were able to have a metric for warmth, it feels like it would be increasing,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's encouraging, right? So we're not messing our kids up if we don't enroll them in a jillion things and make them, fit a super tight schedule.
Yeah.
Which is a relief.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we can shift for a second and talk about these issues of race. I was thinking when you mentioned the zero-sum game, Tim, I think it was in the Joanna interview, we talked about what white supremacy really is. And it's something that so many people are very uncomfortable, like a term that a lot of people are really uncomfortable using. And she kind of explained that white advantage at the expense of any other group is white supremacy. And that's just the only word for it. And that's what you call it. And so I think there are a lot of ways that we're sort of being socialized into believing that our life is a zero-sum game, that we have to win and somebody else has to lose. And so I think it's so important that we're having this conversation now around race and trying to figure out what part we play in this whole system and how we can do better and make the system better. So would you talk about now with this time that we all have to think about this and to readjust our values and reconstruct how our lives are going to look? Would you talk about ways that you are thinking about race and what you can do or what we can do personally to improve equality in our own country?
So the pandemic has really laid bare the ways in which all around the world, people who are marginalized or minorities or have suffered more than others and don't enjoy those same privileges. So there's a couple of things. One is my kids call it a sweatshop or slave labor, but I have encouraged my kids to serve by sewing masks. So they did those medical masks when the church was helping to make 5 million medical masks. They helped with that. And it took them a long time, but they ended up doing a pretty good job. And they also sewed masks for people who needed them. And in the middle of the George Floyd case and the other things that surrounded it, we had some conversations in our household about race, and we've had these conversations for a long time actually, because we've moved to different places. So when you're in China, it's very racially homogenous. There's just mostly Han Chinese people, and anyone who's not that stands out a lot. Hong Kong is the same way. In New Zealand, they were in a very, very diverse, multiracial school in a country that encourages multiculturalism and talks about, and kind of honors Maori heritage in particular, because it's New Zealand. So we had conversations about race before, but with all the things going on, we have, shown the movies, we've had conversations with them about what exactly is happening and what would, it's kind of, we're kind of on both sides of that issue right now, because COVID has brought a surge of racist incidents against Asians as well. And I'm Asian and my kids are biracial. And so I've had to kind of prepare them in many ways to say, if someone calls you a racial slur, or if they say something like that, then you'll know at that point what it feels like, what racism feels like. And when that happens to you, don't take it personally, but understand that that's what racism feels like. And then you'll know what everyone else is talking about. And then on the other side of the coin, we've said, if you're at school and someone calls someone a racial slur, what will you say? And we've kind of had them like rehearse these different scenarios. So we've been having those conversations. And then I've also dragged them into my project on trying to help kids who have been affected by the learning gap created by COVID, and to trying to get resources to the teachers to help those kids. So yeah, unfortunately, my kids are always getting dragged into lots of projects, but
borders. Nope, that's what you get without boundaries.
That's right. That's right. It's no problem. I think it's good for them. And I hope that these issues are on their radar screens. I mean, they're not super young, so I think they're old enough to understand. And they've experienced these things a little bit before. I remember one day in New Zealand, Kai came home crying, and he said people were talking to him for being Chinese and saying things like he couldn't even speak English properly or something like that. I was like, I think they're mixing you up with Americans, Kai. Like, you got an American accent. But yeah, I don't know. That was a very long and rambling answer. I guess the point is that race is a complicated issue, and is a complex issue as it affects my family in particular, because we're a multiracial family. So we've been trying to kind of prepare them to have people say racist things to them, as well as to be prepared to defend other kids when people say racist things to other kids.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like that's the starting point for all of us, right? Like, recognize where we fit, like where do we fit into the story, because it's something that is touching us all, whether or not we've recognized it yet.
Yeah. It's so interesting how kids how race is so culturally learned. So for example, I remember we were living in China, and as I said, it's a pretty stark difference between like a Chinese looking person and a white looking person to an adult. But sometimes we would go to our kids and we'd say, so is sister so-and-so white or Chinese? And she'd be like this, very pale faced lady with red hair and, light colored eyes. And they'd be like,
wow.
I don't know. And then we realized that for them, like, they thought that they couldn't tell. We're like, how can you not tell? But they're like, I don't know. Like, does she speak Chinese? Or it wasn't like, they had not learned that category yet.
Yeah.
They hadn't learned to like classify people. So it's really interesting. And if you think about it, like the classifications of race are so arbitrary, like what is supposed to make someone quote unquote white, or whatever. It's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe that's part of the battle. It's like, it's hard as a parent to know what to do if it feels like your kids don't even see it, like they're so oblivious to the problem because they don't even recognize the difference yet. And of course, if that responsibility is never addressed, then it turns into a color blindness as an adult that it doesn't help anyone, but it's hard as a parent to know how to introduce them to that and feel like it will be a positive thing for our society and not something negative, because they're just so innocent. Right.
I think kids, are famously cruel, like on the playground. They're also famously honest. So it's always kids who will say, you have no hair, or where's your hair? So they notice these kinds of things. But kids are also famously able to accept difference just because they haven't learned that difference is horrible yet. And I think that, I think they just, as we expose our kids to lots of different environments and lots of different people, that's a gift that we can give to them to live in a bigger world.
Especially if the goal is back to warmth, isn't that the way to open doors to warmth? Like having that kind of connection and vulnerability with neighbors, recognizing difference and modeling that acceptance, I think seems like a really good way to introduce this idea of warmth in relationships and would probably take care of a lot of these issues, right?
Right. Well, and I guess when we came to Utah, we came from a really ethnically diverse environment to an environment that's a lot more ethnically homogenous. So I've worked hard to try to make sure that we're not always in a little bubble that looks exactly the same. So I've been deliberate about that and choosing a high school for my kids. We're not going to the local high school. We're going to a high school that's got more diversity. because I see it as a critical part of their education. Also, I take them with me when we go in volunteering with the refugee community in Utah as well, just because I want them to be exposed to people from other cultures, other languages. Our kids have learned some phrases in Dari just to be able to communicate with the family that we hang out with. So it's just really important for me, for my kids to understand that people do the people thing in so many different ways, and languages and looks and whatever.
Yeah. And you can be totally intentional about that. I think that's a real hard thing. If you live in a neighborhood where it is just predominantly white, it can feel like, well, I don't have friends from anywhere else. So like, what am I supposed to do? But you can seek that out. I know even, so we're in Utah County, and multiple libraries have like a Spanish speaking story time. And like, that's such an easy way. It's open to the public, and you can go sit down and hear a story that told in another language. But it takes some thought. It takes some real.
And Utah's really good about it, because with the immersion programs, for instance, so there's, the kids can learn from a really early age about language and how different that is, and it actually rewires your brain in different ways. So bilingual people think differently from monolingual people, and they have kind of more resources available to them cognitively. So I think that's a really wonderful thing that Utah has to offer, is these places where kids can be completely immersed in a language and in a culture, and respect, teachers who are speaking to them not in English. That's really awesome.
Yeah.
Melissa, maybe just as we wrap up, you shared an analogy before we started recording about a way that people may see the world in a different way in terms of planning for the future and busyness and all of those things due to the pandemic, and due to just the way that the year has unfolded so far. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing that.
Sure. So I was trying to think about, I was listening to the other Faith Matters podcast, and listening to your very eminent and intelligent and very charming guests talk about how this pandemic is such a disruption, because now you can't plan, or now you don't know what the future looks like, and it's a source of anxiety. And I thought, wow, that's just like it's like the reality of cancer patients. Now everyone knows how it feels to be a cancer patient, because you just stop planning for the future. And because the most important thing is, what happens day to day, and you actually have no way of planning for the future because you don't know what's going to happen. So I guess this is like great, because it can give everyone empathy for people who have hardcore chronic illnesses. And it's also good because I think it's been very beneficial to have that outlook. I used to be a super hardcore planner. So in my yearly Christmas letters, maybe for the first 5 years that I sent them, I would send out a 15-year plan. Like I would include that in my Christmas letter. And they would say like, this is where we are this year, but like in 5 years, we're going to be here, and 10 years, we're going to be here, and 15 years, we're going to be here. And like, obviously at a certain point, I just like scrapped that. I'm like, no, the plan is not working. But I'm just saying, I used to really plan things like far in advance, because I thought if I just do the right things, then everything will, fall into place, and I'll have the life that I want. But that obviously didn't happen. And in so many ways, and many of them which have been very joyful. So I guess I'm just saying it's not horrible to not plan. A lot of people live like that. A lot of people who don't have stability and security live like that. So maybe this can give us compassion and empathy for people who don't have stability and security in their health, or in their finances, or in their faith. And it can also help us to just enjoy, what God's giving us now, and to love the people who are around us right now.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I love that. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening, and a special thanks to Melissa for coming on. And to everybody who's left a positive review of our podcast or content on any platform, we really appreciate it. We do read each review and comment, and we're grateful for the encouragement and for helping get the word out about Faith Matters. We hope everybody's staying healthy and safe, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.